So fellas, this weekend we've got Jared Cannonier taking on Gregory Rodrigues. Actually quite a decent card for an Apex card. And there's some pretty good fights in there. And as always, we're going to be breaking down every fighter on this card, as well as my own personal predictions. And we'll just go in there with the first fight. We've got Gabriel Bonfim versus Khaos Williams. This is a really tough fight to call. If you look at the career of Gabriel Bonfim, comes into the UFC on this huge winning streak, LFA champion, a bunch of stoppages, gets a stoppage on the Contender Series as well, followed up by another stoppage, followed up by another stoppage, then eventually gets finished by Nicolas Dalbe, which isn't a good look. A lot of people saying he got fraud checked, and then he picked up a decision win for the first time in his most recent fight against Souza, which is still his only decision win, and every other one of his fights have ended by stoppage. Going to be taking on Khaos Williams, who also had a pretty decent career outside the UFC. Debuts against Alex Morono, gets a knockout win in his next fight, and in his past couple of fights he's done decent. He lost to Michel Pereira and Randy Brown, two elite strikers, but apart from that he's been running through people and he's delivered a lot of brutal knockouts too. So it's a tough fight to call because they are both very talented, and I don't really want to keep throwing around the term prospect, but they both are on the come up. You've got Gabriel Bonfim, very well rounded, 16-1, lost to Nicolas Dalbe, but he's a great jiu-jitsu guy with amazing striking. You've got Khaos Williams, an extremely dangerous striker, and that's why it's tough, because you've got a very dangerous, powerful striker with decent takedown defense in Khaos Williams versus Gabriel Bonfim, who's definitely the more well-rounded out of the two of them. But I would say if anyone's going to get finished, it's probably going to be Khaos Williams delivering a knockout. But I am going to be going with Gabriel Bonfim by decision. Close fight. If you are a betting man, I wouldn't recommend betting on this fight. I just believe that Gabriel Bonfim will be able to do enough to outstrike Khaos Williams. He has been improving in every single one of his fights. Even though he obviously didn't get a finish, he did look quite good in his most recent fight, coming back from the Nicolas Dalbe loss. And on top of that, I think him taking the fight to the mat is going to be a big game plan. It's going to affect the striking of Khaos Williams, and it just gives another area for Gabriel Bonfim to win. So I'm going to be going with Gabriel Bonfim to win via decision against Khaos Williams. But again, I think this is a really good fight to kick off the card. And it's a really close fight as well. Two dangerous guys, two guys on the come up. But I'm going to go Bonfim. Now, the opposite of somebody on the come up is going to be Angela Hill as she takes on Ketlen Souza. She's 40 years of age. Angela Hill, she's been in the UFC for a long time. She might have actually one of the worst records on paper in the UFC right now, with a record of 17-14. But she gets a professional MMA debut and wins it, and then immediately gets a shot at the Ultimate Fighter against Carla Esparza. Loses to Carla Esparza, but then still wins on the Ultimate Fighter. Then loses her first two UFC fights. Goes on a 4-fight winning streak, and then since then she's kind of just been all over the place. Picks up a couple of wins recently, then goes on another 3-fight losing streak against Tisha Penton, Amanda Lemos, and Virgil Jandiroba, and now in the most recent fights again she seems to be a lot more consistent with the wins and the loss. She's just a win-loss fighter, is everything you need to know about 41-year-old Angela Hill. She's going to be taking on Ketlen Souza, who had a huge MMA career outside the UFC, which for a woman is actually quite impressive, because women MMA doesn't seem to be the most, in-depth outside of the UFC. She managed to become a champion as well in a different organization, got a submission loss in a UFC debut to Karine Silva, but since then has pulled off two good wins in the UFC, recently choked out Yasmin at UFC 306. You've got the veteran in Angela Hill, who's been in the UFC for over a decade. You've got the new one on the block in Ketlen Souza. Angela Hill's not that good though. Like, it's not only just her record that's telling me that. She hasn't got the best speed, her grappling isn't the best, and she's now taking on this quite explosive young grappler. Ketlen Souza. I'm picking Ketlen Souza to win by decision. She could even pull off a submission in this fight. We know that if there's any style that doesn't really work against Angela Hill, it tends to be grapplers. She tends to lose or at least struggle with grapplers more than anything. And Ketlen Souza's coming off that brutal submission win at UFC 306. Where she left Yasmin out cold as well, so she looked really good in that fight. I'm going to go Ketlen Souza by decision. Again, probably not worth betting on. There's a lot of 50-50 fights in this card. If Angela Hill's going to win, it's going to be by some kind of slow, unanimous decision where she just outpoints her for 3 rounds straight. She's got the experience, she's got the veteran expertise in the UFC, but I'm going to go with Ketlen Souza. She has impressed me in her past 2 fights. Angela Hill is, even though she's still getting consistent wins, and I can't say she needs to retire, is definitely on the back end of her career. I'm going Ketlen Souza by decision. Then we have Rafael Estevam versus Jesus Aguilar. I don't think Jesus is how you pronounce it because it's a Mexican name, but I'm going to call him Jesus. Anyway, you've got Rafael Estevam. This guy's undefeated, and again, as you'd expect, had a really good career outside the UFC. Gets a finish on the Contender Series, and then beats Charles Johnson in his UFC debut, which, obviously Charles Johnson's on a complete roll right now. He's super impressive, and that was all the way back in November of 2023. He hasn't fought since then. Going to be taking on Caio Fernandez, who lost his MMA debut, which he must have took personally because he went on this giant winning streak with a bunch of guillotines. Gets submitted in his UFC debut against Tatsuro Taira, but since then he's on a 3-fight winning streak with 2 finishes, and he just recently beat Stuart Nickel at UFC 305. It's quite a tough one to call. But I think Rafael Estevam is probably the best unranked guy in the flyweight division. I did a video, like, it must have been like 6 months ago now, where I went over the toughest fight for Pantoja outside the rankings, and Rafael Estevam was my pick. I think he's going to out-wrestle Aguilar in this fight. He's got really good wrestling, and his jiu-jitsu's on point as well. I just think he's going to out-wrestle him. He looked really good in that fight with Charles Johnson as well. He's undefeated. He's this guy, like I said, I think he should be ranked, or at least he will. I think if he beats Aguilar, I'm going to go Rafael Estevam by decision. I think he out-wrestles Aguilar. Aguilar's good. I think if anyone's going to get a submission, I could actually see that being Aguilar, because he has got a good submission game. On the feet, they're fairly even, but I'm going Rafael Estevam to get a good win against Aguilar and win via decision. But good fight. I think the winner of this fight will definitely get a shot at the rankings in the flyweight division, because obviously Aguilar's only lost to Tyra, and Rafael Estevam has beat Charles Johnson, who's in the rankings too. So I'm hoping the winner of this fight is going to get somebody in the rankings. I'm going Estevam. Then we have the complete opposite end of the spectrum, 2 heavyweights, and they aren't great, if I'm being honest. You've got Valter Walker versus Dontale Mayes, who's now ranked number 15th in the heavyweight division. Valter Walker, if you didn't know, is the brother of Johnny Walker. Obviously, the crazy light heavyweight. He actually had a really good career outside of the UFC. He was a bit of a prospect in the heavyweight division. Comes over to the UFC as a champion in a different organization. Faces Lucas Brzeski, quite possibly the easiest fight he could get given. And he looked disgusting in that fight. He looked horrible against Lucas Brzeski, which is probably one of the easiest fights you could get given in the heavyweight division. But in his most recent fight, he looked improved. He pulled off a submission against Justin Taff, then ended up getting slapped in the face for it at the end of the fight. Going to be taking on Dontale Mayes, who had a pretty bad career outside the UFC, even though we did pick up wins over Harry Hunsucker and Mohammed Usman, 2 guys that have and are competing in the UFC. Came from to Dana White's Contender Series, got a win off there, then kind of didn't get a UFC contract, got back on the Contender Series, got another win, and since then he's practically just been a bit of a win-loss fighter in the heavyweight division, and recently just got mauled by Shamil Gaziev. Again, it's not an easy one to pick, because I could see Dontale Mayes just outboxing Valter Walker, who has horrible striking, but I could also see Valter Walker taking him down. Dontale Mayes, I don't know how to explain his style. He's very mid, which isn't a surprise when we talked about these unranked heavyweights. I'm going to go Valter Walker by submission in the first round. It's either going to be by submission or by decision. Yeah, Dontale Mayes historically does bad against grapplers. I mean, I know we just got mauled by Shamil Gaziev, but you go back to the fight with Rodrigo Nascimento, he was getting mauled by Nascimento. And I will say about Valter Walker, he did look a lot more improved in his recent fight against Justin Tafa. His grappling seemed to be on point. And yes, he is fighting Justin Tafa, or Judy Tafa, should I say, who might be one of the worst heavyweights in the UFC right now, but Dontale Mayes isn't a great grappler. Valter Walker, you know, I just think he's going to take him down, potentially find a submission in the first round against Dontale Mayes, or at least grind him out and get a decision. I didn't pick a late submission because, Valter Walker's probably going to get gassed out and it's going to be a bit of a sloppy fight. But if he is going to get the win, I think submission in the first round for Valter Walker is probably one of the most likely methods of victory. Then we have Vince Morales versus Elijah Smith. Now, Vince Morales has to have one of the weirdest UFC runs. He was on an absolute tear outside of the UFC, winning the vast majority of his fights by finish, coming up to the UFC, gets submitted on the Contender Series, gets another win in Bellator, then he ends up losing 3 of his next 4 fights in the UFC, gets given a UFC contract and still has a UFC contract despite losing all those fights. Ends up going 2-2 in his next 4 fights after that losing streak. And then he goes on a complete tear outside the UFC between 2023 and 2024. 5 wins, 4 finishes. Gets another chance at the UFC against Taylor Lapilus at UFC Paris and loses that by decision. And again, he's still in the UFC. Obviously going to be taking on Elijah Smith. There's not really much to say about Elijah Smith. He's had a pretty chaotic start to his MMA career. Actually ended up losing to Tracy Cortez's brother. Goes on a bit of a winning streak, comes through the Contender Series, gets the decision win. I mean, he's just getting started. There's not really anything to talk about. I'm going to go with Elijah Smith to win this one by decision. Again, not a super confident pick because Vince Morales, if we're being real, he's losing to good fighters. Like, you look at a lot of his losses in the UFC, it tends to be to decent fighters like Song Yadong, Chris Gutierrez, recently Taylor Lapilus. So he isn't losing to complete bums. But I just think Elijah Smith, you look back to his Contender Series fight, he looked good. He looked good with the wrestling. His stand-up seemed to be on point, even across 3 rounds. It wasn't like he had a dodgy gas tank. I'm not going to keep throwing around the word prospect to everybody who's coming through on the Contender Series, but Elijah Smith does look pretty promising. He does seem to be well-rounded, a good gas tank. And Vince Morales, he's a tough guy too. Lost to Taylor Lapilus, but he went the distance. I'm going to go Elijah Smith by decision though. Again, not a fight that's worth betting on. I just think that Elijah Smith has looked good and he has looked better than Vince Morales has based on their performances, even though it's kind of tough when you look at the level of competition that they've both faced. Then we've got Julia Avila versus Jacqueline Cavelcanti. Julia Avila, there's not really anything to say. She had a decent run, I guess, outside the UFC, and so far in the UFC, again, there's nothing really to talk about. She's lost twice to Miesha Tate and Eubanks, but she's had some good finishes as well. She's quite an overwhelming, high-pressure fighter, which is kind of fun to see, with the most recent fight getting submitted by Miesha Tate after getting dominated. Going to be taking on Cavelcanti. Again, nothing really to say. She had a couple of wins and losses outside the UFC, became an LFA champion, and is so far 3-0 in the UFC with 3 decisions. I mean, there's not really much to talk about in this fight. I'm going to go with Cavelcanti by decision because I think she's pretty skilled. Good striker, decent takedown defense. Julia Avila's been out since December, I think, of 2023 when she got submitted by Miesha Tate. She's getting up there in age. She's not the best from like a technique perspective. So I'm going to go Cavelcanti to win a decision. Quite a confident pick, but again, there's not really much you can really talk about in this fight. Next fight we have is Rodolfo Viera versus Andre Petroski. I'm actually kind of looking forward to this fight. Rodolfo Viera, I know he lost to Hernandez and Curtis, but those are 2 good names. And he's actually quite a good prospect in the middleweight division. If you don't know Rodolfo Viera, he comes from this heavy grappling background. He's like, he was one of the best grapplers, or still is one of the best grapplers in the UFC. He's competed in some of the best jiu-jitsu tournaments in the world. In his first couple of fights in MMA, including the UFC, he just went on a complete tear of stoppages, bunch of first-round finishes of just submissions in his UFC run. He was a massive prospect in the UFC. Ends up getting submitted by Anthony Hernandez as well. After completely gassing out after the first round, pulls off another win over Dustin Stoltz for submits him, loses to Chris Curtis, and now he's on a 2-fight winning streak with 2 submissions. Going to be taking on Andre Petroski, who had a very kind of chaotic start to his MMA career, bunch of stoppages, ended up getting finished in LFA, goes on the Ultimate Fighter, wins and loses to Brian Battle. Well, he doesn't win, he wins and then loses to Brian Battle. Then after that, he goes on a complete tear in the UFC, 5 straight wins with a couple of finishes. But he's knocked himself out. There was a fight where he knocked himself out, where he shot for a takedown. Then he ended up getting finished as well. And now he's on a 2-fight winning streak against Josh Fremden and Dylan Budka. It's also notable to say that he has competed in a couple of grappling tournaments himself against the likes of OSP, Phil Hawes, and Eric Anders. So they've both got a very heavy grappling style. Andre Petroski is mainly a wrestler. Rodolfo Viera is this heavy jiu-jitsu guy. But I think Andre Petroski, his only chance of winning this fight is if he can kind of outpoint Rodolfo Viera with like a heavy wrestling style, which tends to be his style in the UFC. And I don't like his odds when he's facing a guy in Rodolfo Viera who every single one of his wins come by way of stoppage, and it's all submissions. I think Rodolfo Viera's got some of the best submissions in the UFC. Seems to be improving every fight, even with his stand-up as well. I'm going Rodolfo Viera by submission in the first round. I think he pressures Andre Petroski early on. Petroski shoots a panic takedown, and then eventually he gets caught in some sort of submission against Rodolfo Viera. Yeah, I just don't really see a chance. I mean, if you're going to knock yourself out by shooting a takedown like Petroski did, then what's to say you're not going to get caught in a guillotine when shooting a takedown against somebody like Rodolfo Viera? So, and you look at the guys who Rodolfo Viera is losing to as well. Anthony Hernandez, big middleweight prospect. Chris Curtis, probably one of the worst matchups for him stylistically. Chris Curtis has one of the best anti-grappling styles, but I'm going Rodolfo Viera to submit in the first round. Then we have Edmen Shahbazyan versus Dylan Budka. Shahbazyan is a very dangerous striker. MMA career starts off every one of his stoppages by first round knockout, comes into the UFC via Contender Series, gets a 40-second knockout, then also goes straight to the Ultimate Fighter after the Contender Series, gets another stoppage win there. Oh no, he gets a decision win on the Ultimate Fighter, but then starts his UFC career off with 3 straight finishes, and at this point he's a huge prospect, undefeated, a bunch of wins, bunch of stoppages, and then his career kind of had a bit of a mess recently. He's taken a lot of losses to the likes of Brunson, Hermanson, Imavov, Hernandez, and GM3, so it's not like he's losing to but he's definitely taken a turn in his MMA career recently. Going to be taking on Dylan Budka, who is a Division 1 wrestler. Lost his MMA debut, but then went on a bit of had a couple of wins after that. Ended up losing to Azat Bekaev for the LFA belt, and obviously we just saw Bekaev debut at UFC 311, and he got a submission win after that, comes from the Contender Series, gets a finish, and then he's lost his last 2 fights to Cesar Almeida and Andre Petroski. I'm going Shahbazyan by KO in the first round. You know, Shahbazyan, he's losing to guys with decent name value. He's not losing to Kanzan. He's a mean striker as well. If you watch him strike, he's a very technical and dangerous kickboxer, very tough to beat on the feet. And Dylan Budka's just not that good. He's not that good of a wrestler. I mean, he's a decent wrestler. He's a better wrestler than you know, some guys on the roster, but he's not the best wrestler in the world, and he's even worse at striking. His gas tank's horrible. He's just not a great fighter. I'm kind of surprised he's still got a UFC contract, to be fair. Shahbazyan was once a massive prospect, and even though he's taken a couple of losses, he's losing it to the likes of Imavov, Hernandez, Mearshot, you know, guys with good name value. So I'm going to go Shahbazyan by knockout in the first round. I think he pieces him up, backs him up against the cage, and lands a big shot and knocks him out. And then we've got Jose Delgado versus Conor Matthews. Jose Delgado, dangerous guy. Every single one of his wins by stoppage, 4 knockouts, 4 submissions, and never won a fight by decision. Had a decent run outside the UFC, as you'd expect, winning in the promotions like LFA. Comes from the Contender Series, gets a good stoppage in the Contender Series, and now has got a UFC contract. Going to be taking on Conor Matthews, who also had a pretty decent start to his MMA career. 5 wins, 5 straight finishes. Loses on the Contender Series to Marshall, then gets another win outside of the UFC. Gets another shot at the Contender Series, wins on that, and then got knocked out in his most recent fight. So, I'm going to be picking Delgado to win this fight. I think he knocks him out in the second round. Delgado, he looks pretty talented on the feet, does Delgado. He's quite a nice, crafty striker, quite a breath of fresh air from, the normal fighters that tend to come from the Contender Series. He looks pretty talented. And Conor Matthews isn't a bad striker, but he does hit quite a lot. You look at his fights, he hasn't got the best defense. His head movement's pretty questionable as well. He gets caught quite a bit. I can see Delgado landing a big shot on Conor Matthews in this fight, and considering how dangerous Delgado is, and the fact that Conor Matthews has just been knocked out by a lower level fighter in Dennis Bazooka, I think Delgado's going to get that knockout. I'm predicting a second round KO for Jose Delgado. Kind of filling each other out in the first round. Second round, lands one down the pipe, knocks out Conor Matthews. I'm going Delgado to knock him out in the second round. Then we have Ismael Bonfim versus Nazim Sadykhov. Now, obviously, Ismael Bonfim is the brother of Gabriel Bonfim, so they're both competing on this card, the Bonfim bros. Ismael had a bit of a rough start to his MMA career, unlike Gabriel. Lost the first 2 of his first 3 fights, then picks up a couple of wins. Loses again to Renato Moicano on the regional scene, where Moicano was looking like 80. I think this is a 145, might have even been a 135-pound fight. Then after losing to Moicano, goes on a complete tear outside the UFC. Massive winning streak. Comes on the Contender Series, gets a stoppage win. Then he brutally knocks out Terrence McKinney. I think this was 2023, in like a knockout of the year contender. Brutalizes Terrence McKinney. Then he gets submitted by Benoit Saint-Denis, and recently pulling off a win over Vince Pichel at UFC 301. Going to be taking on Nazim Sadykhov, who lost his MMA debut by stoppage, then goes on a complete knockout tear outside of that. Comes in the Contender Series, gets a knockout win in the Contender Series, beats Evan Elder by stoppage, then gets another stoppage, loses to Borshev, has a draw with Borshev, and since then he's been out and now is coming back against Ismael Bonfim. It is notable to say that Nazim Sadykhov has been out since, I think, November of 2023 as well, so he's been out for quite some time. He's a good prospect. Another one that's really tough to call. I would not recommend betting on this fight. It's not an easy one to call, but I'm leaning towards Bonfim winning this one. I think the Bonfim bros are both going to be successful. Yeah, it's a tough fight to call with Nazim Sadykhov, because as dangerous as he is, it's not like he's dominating every single one of his fights. He lost the first round, in my opinion, to Elder. Even in that Terrence McKinney fight, if anybody was winning on the scorecards previous to the stoppage, previous to the win over McKinney, it would have been Terrence McKinney winning that fight. And the Elder fight wasn't even like he finished him properly. It was a cut. And in that Borshev fight, it went back and forth with Borshev, and maybe after recently how Borshev's been competing, that wasn't that good of a look when you're drawing with Borshev. So I'm going with Bonfim. He lost to Benoit Saint-Denis when Saint-Denis was in his prospect phase. He's got good jiu-jitsu, does Bonfim, but his striking's even more special. So I'm going Bonfim by decision. It's a tough one to call, not an easy one. Wouldn't surprise me if Sadykhov can somehow knock him out or get a decision win, but I'm going Bonfim decision. Then we have the co-main event, Kattar returning to the octagon since UFC 300 against 2.0 Youssef Zalal. Now, Kattar, he doesn't need any introduction. Top 10 featherweight of the world. Comes into the UFC as this big prospect, really good boxer, only loses to the likes of Moicano and Zabit Sharipov, and he's this dangerous boxer in the UFC that the UFC keep marketing. But in his past couple of performances, he's lost 4 of his last 5 fights, and his career just hasn't really been going the best way. He obviously has that dominating performance by Max Holloway, where he gets the brakes absolutely beat off him by Max Holloway in one of the most memorable featherweight performances in history. Then he absolutely roughs up Jacqueline in his next fight just to get kind of robbed against Josh Emmett, loses to Josh Emmett, injured against Donald Allen, and absolutely dominated by Aljamain Sterling at UFC 300. He's going to be taking on Youssef Zalal, who had a pretty decent career outside the UFC, couple of wins, couple of losses. Wins his first 2 UFC fights, then goes on a 3-fight losing streak. Is actually one of the only fighters to go to a decision with Ilia Topuria as well, which is, I guess, is a good look. Then he has a draw with Damon Blackshear, which the UFC decides to cut him for. Gets 3 wins outside of that in 2022 and 2023. And now we're starting to see Youssef Zalal 2.0, where he's now on a 3-fight winning streak in the UFC, all by stoppages. Recently beat Jack Shaw, where he dropped him and immediately submitted him in the second round. He looks like a real good prospect in the featherweight division of Youssef Zalal, and I'm picking him to win. I'm going Youssef Youssef Zalal to win this one by decision. It's a tough one because Cavelcanti is definitely, I mean, we've seen a lot more from Cavelcanti. He's always been at the highest level, and I could see Cavelcanti keeping the fat on the feet and just completely outboxing him. But I will say about Cavelcanti, I don't think he does well with grapplers. I'm not just saying this because he's just been dominated by Aljamain Sterling, but you look at his record, and outside of Aljamain Sterling, when has he ever faced a grappler? Allen, Emmett, Chikadze, Holloway, Ige, Stevens, Magomed Sharipov, all of these guys since 2019 have all been strikers. It's not even like he's getting through these strikers as well. Youssef Zalal is a sharp, snappy striker. I'd actually say as of today, he's probably more dangerous than Kattar, and obviously the jiu-jitsu as well to back it up. I think he takes down Cavelcanti at some point in the fight, and I think he just racks up the control time. I could even see him getting a submission, but I think the ground game of Youssef Zalal is going to be too much for Cavelcanti. I think he beats him by decision. And we're seeing this in the featherweight division. Featherweight, for the longest time, hasn't really had the most grapplers in. You know, featherweight has always been a striking heavy division. So when we see the likes of Sterling and Movsar Evloev come in the division, a lot of these strikers are kind of getting found out, and Cavelcanti was one of them. And now that you put him against Youssef Zalal, and also what's the mental state of Cavelcanti going to be like when he's lost 4 of his last 5 and his most recent losses to a grappler, I'm going Youssef Zalal by decision. I think he pulls this one off, gets a decision win. If not, I think he submits him. The only chance I really see Cavelcanti have of winning this fight is if he magically has amazing takedown defense since UFC 300 and he can just outbox Zalal. So I'm going Youssef Zalal by decision. Then we've got the main event, how the fuck do I fumble the name that bad? Jared Cannonier, the Killer Gorilla, taking on RoboCop Gregory Rodrigues. This is a really good fight in the middleweight division. Glad the UFC allowed RoboCop to get a ranking spot. Now, Jared Cannonier is one of the only fighters in the UFC to compete in 3 different weight classes. Started off in the heavyweight division, then went to light heavyweight, and then finally middleweight. And this just shows that a lot of the heavyweights currently are just undisciplined. Cannonier wasn't even in terrible shape in the heavyweight division for a normal heavyweight, and now he's made middleweight, which is where he's deciding to stay. He had a pretty decent middleweight run. He only lost to Robert Whittaker, and apart from that, he had a couple of good wins over the likes of Anderson Silva, brutalized Derek Brunson, finished Jack Hermansson, so he had a lot of good wins. Ended up getting a title shot against Ismael Adesanya, where he actually lost a really boring decision. After losing to Adesanya, went on a 2-fight winning streak, beat Strickland by close decision, and absolutely brutalized Marvin Vettori, until his last couple of performances where he's been finished by Nassourdine Imavov, and he nearly got finished, but he lost a decision to Caio Borralho in his most recent fight. Going to be taking on Gregory Rodrigues, who had a really good start to his MMA career, lost his first couple of fights, but since then he went on a bit of a tear. Actually ended up getting finished on the Contender Series, got 2 wins in LFA by knockout, and since then this guy's just been in an absolute tear. He's so dangerous. He's kind of like the Sergey Pavlovich in the middleweight division, just a very dangerous walk forward wild striker, and it's worked in his favour. Now, it is to note he has been knocked out by Bruno Ferreira in 2023, which isn't, I guess, the best look, but the point is Gregory Rodrigues is a very walk forward, all guns blazing, kind of Sergey Pavlovich-esque dangerous striker. He also trains with the likes of Gilbert Burns. He's got good jiu-jitsu. It's a tough one to call because I actually think Cannonier is going to win the early rounds of this fight. I think Cannonier, from a technique perspective, is definitely the better striker out of him and Gregory. And Gregory, even though he's dangerous, he is very hittable on the feet as well. So I don't think he's going to be a complete Gregory Rodrigues, you know, just blow through where he dominates Cannonier. I think Cannonier will have success early, but eventually the fact that he's 41 years old, he hasn't had a finish in ages. He's on a 2-fight losing streak, and he's coming back after quite some time. Well, actually, it's not that long. He fought in August, but either way, I'm going to go with RoboCop to get a TKO in this fight. I think RoboCop's going to finish Jared Cannonier. I could see him just walking forward with that kind of blitz, heavy, kind of powerful style against Jared Cannonier and running through him. He recently fought Christine Leroy Duncan, who's a very bad matchup for Gregory Rodrigues, and he completely battered him as well. And I think he does the same to Cannonier. I can see Cannonier winning the first round, maybe gassing out, or maybe Gregory Rodrigues comes alive in those later rounds, specifically the 3rd round in the middle of the fight, and I can just see him getting a TKO against Cannonier, backing him up against the cage. It is in the apex as well, so the octagon's going to be smaller, and just unloaded on Jared Cannonier, getting a stoppage. And I also question the chin of Cannonier nowadays as well, getting wobbled by Imavov, getting nearly knocked out by Caio Borralho. So I'm going to go Gregory Rodrigues to TKO Jared Cannonier in the 3rd round. But those are my picks and my breakdown for UFC Vegas 102, Cannonier versus Gregory Rodrigues. Let me know your thoughts on this card, if you agree, disagree, the predictions, and thank you for watching.